So this webinar series is targeted towards our CIRC team members, but we wanted to open the series up to other NOAA RESA teams, DOI climate science centers, and USDA climate hubs and other affiliated networks, as this is a topic of wide interest for many working in the climate services sphere. So the format of today's webinar, like Kai said, will be about a 40-minute presentation followed by 10 minutes of general questions, and then the final 10 minutes of the hour we'd like to reserve for discussion among our CIRC team members. And everyone is welcome to listen into that, but as we'll take everyone off mute, if you don't wish to speak during that time, please be sure to mute yourself so that we can have a discussion at the end. Again, thanks everyone for joining, and Holly, go ahead.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks everybody for being here today. I hope you find this useful, and I'd be happy to hear from you anytime after the webinar about any of the content. My email is here. You can get a hold of me that way. What we're going to talk about today is decision support tool design, something very fundamental to a lot of projects. We're going to focus on the priorities and then strategies and tactics for designing tools. So here's the outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about decision support and what it is, give a little bit about my own history, talk about how this fits within the assessment framework under the CIRC 2.0 project, and then we'll get down to the meat of the talk about the priorities for design and strategies and tactics, and then we'll finish up with some open-ended questions for next steps. So what is decision support? What are decision support tools? I like to follow the description, the definition put out by the National Research Council's report in Informing Decisions in a Changing Climate that extends decision support from efforts to just produce and disseminate data and information, but it extends that definition to facilitate the use of data and information to improve decisions as well. So it's not enough just to produce data and transmit information. We're really trying to connect with the wisdom of decision makers and develop their knowledge about that information. They can bring it into their past experience, like this dog may have had here in the past, and connect it with their values. Why am I talking about this? Over the last 30 years or so, I've been involved with a number of decision support projects in designing tools, whether they're reports and guidebooks, like this one on scenario planning, or looking at the use of tools, online tools for large group efforts, evaluating hundreds of tools through the Carpe Diem West Academy, helping groups extend their tools to new regions and new functionalities like the Ag Climate Risk Tool or the Dynamic Drought Index tool that were developed by RESA projects. I've been involved in resurrecting tools and helping groups design tools, and I myself have led the development of a number of tools, some very successful, some abject failures. So that's where what you're going to hear today, that's kind of where it comes from, is based on this accumulation of experience and connection with other tool developers over the years as well. We all struggle with these same topics, the same issues. There's no easy resolution to some of them. Within CIRC 2.0, these are the research and development questions related to decision support tools. I've outlined each of them in red because today's presentation addresses each of these questions about how can decision support tools effectively facilitate the use of data and information and build adaptive capacity. Can we provide more powerful and effective decision support tools? And then how do we evaluate decision support tools? This topic of design crosses all tools regardless of the sector that you're involved with or the level of expertise that a decision maker may have in working with tools. Last month, like Megan said, I gave a talk on one aspect of evaluating decision support tools from a user perspective, and that was communication effectiveness. One thing that's come out of that presentation is that Eva Sokolovska, who's working with Denise Locke within CIRC 2.0, is now putting together material for developing style sheets and standards documents for communication effectiveness that should be ready. We're going to be trying to have them ready by the July retreat for CIRC 2.0. Today's talk covers design principles, strategies, and tactics. The next webinar will cover a part of the framework that deals with this whole climate science enterprise perspective about technical sustainability. But this kind of shows you where we fit. There are many other topics under Framework A and Framework C that we'll get to in subsequent webinars. So today we're focusing strictly on kind of that very front end, that is on design principles in getting started. Now, I want to make sure that it's clear that when I'm talking about design priorities, I'm not trying to judge anybody's project and what your design priorities are. That's for you to decide. I'm just going to lay some things out, but I'm not judging anybody's project. It does help if your design priorities are a conscious decision that's explicitly communicated within your project. I'm just going to propose some priorities for CIRC 2.0. It's one of the things I think we need to, that any project needs to discuss and explicitly state what their priorities are, because as you'll see, it does affect what the ultimate decision support tool looks like in the end. And you can tell that from my initial definition of decision support and what is a decision support tool, that I prioritize knowledge development over simple information delivery. That's, for the rest of this presentation, is sort of a fundamental assumption, is that is one of the design priorities. But this next one about there's several priorities you could choose from about what's the goal of your tool. Is it to provide equity of access to information? Or there are some other alternatives. And I'm going to take a minute here to talk a little bit about what some of these alternatives are, because it does affect the design of a tool in some very fundamental ways. Here are two alternatives to equity of access. One is, do you want your decision support tool to have regulatory and policy impact? Something like the National Climate Assessment and all the National Climate Assessment reports, for example, are trying to get at policy and regulatory impact. The kind of decision support that you do is more traditional. That is, documents need to be refereed, tools need to be refereed, there needs to be a link to where it fits in a decision process. An alternative priority would be, an alternative objective might be efficiency. That is the efficiency of the investment in your project. So your metric might be something like benefit cost analysis or a return on investment. The implication is that you're going to be working with high value clients and developing customized systems for them that you may then transfer to them, whether it's a private sector client or a public sector agency, but they're your high value client, so you can show that your project had a large return on the money that was spent on it. Examples might be something like Riverware, a forecast system that's sold to or licensed to many organizations. There are other examples that maybe are on a low end that may focus on impact or efficiency. Guidebooks, checklists, training programs, the development of new standards of practice. These are all decision support tools that are not software tools. They're aimed at either having this impact or being efficient, that is economically efficient. The third alternative is, are we looking at equity of access? The kinds of metrics might be, are we getting at a lot of different sectors, a lot of different kinds of populations? Some of those populations may be vulnerable populations. Are we getting deep into a particular sector? Think about that as a market. If our sector is water resources, is our tool reaching a big portion of the water resources sector? An example of this, I would say, is the seasonal climate outlooks, and then bringing that down to the local 3-month temperature outlooks for particular locations. This is, from here on out, this objective of equity is kind of an assumption of where we go forward in talking about design strategies and tactics. The key is if you're looking at equity, we're going to be having a wide range of users. Those users will want analysis that's unique to them because they don't see just general results as being applicable to their specific needs. And then in order to support that kind of tool, we have to think about how to scale that up, that tool up, so that we can have efficiencies in supporting that maintenance of the software over time. And then because we have such a wide range of users, we may want to facilitate the use of intermediaries to support some users who need more attention, whether that's on the high end or more of the beginning user end. And then the lead on from that is that often those kind of tools are software tools, and because they're software tools, the other kind of priorities that might flow from that are that we have to think about how to transition that software from just a research project to sustained operations. And that's the subject of the next webinar, which is about about evaluating the technical sustainability of a tool and how to integrate it into the overall climate science enterprise. And then the other is that if these decision support tools can be major investments of time and people's attention and money. And so how can we evaluate these tools beyond just a software product, but from an academic perspective, how can they be evaluated as scholarly products in and of themselves, not simply as a topic of a journal article, for example. So for the rest of this time, I'm going to focus on these first two elements because this last box is going to be addressed in subsequent webinars. So I'm going to focus on these first two here in the design priorities and what that means for strategies. So in thinking about a design strategy, what we're really focusing on are the goals and the functions of the tools. These are the kinds of things that have to be addressed over the whole lifespan of a tool and over the whole range of functionalities of the tool, what the tool does. These are the kinds of decisions that are difficult to change course on. It can be done, but it can take a lot of effort to rework and refactor a tool if you change your strategy. Now in the blue box here that's outlined, those are the design priorities that we're addressing, and these strategies kind of flow out of that. And that is that to start off with, how do you decide even what tool to create? It's that whole sequence of the kinds of engagement that the RISA programs or the RISA projects are so good at, and others are good at it too, but the RISA projects have been really good at showing how to do this, and that is having this increasing depth of engagement with stakeholders and potential users of a tool, starting with interviews, going with focus groups, doing workshops, and even going all the way through to co-production of a tool. And then also focusing not on asking people what they want in a tool, but really taking a look at what are they trying to do. So much work's been done within different RISA projects of looking at decision calendars, the timing when people are making decisions, what kind of variables they're focused on. There's a lot that's out there already to build on. And then the notion is that just once you start using a tool, you're not really done with the development of the tool. But in this third bullet, we stress that in engaging, using those tools to engage with decision makers in a way that just is supporting discussion is really a way to continue engagement, to develop new functionalities, the new kind of applications for information and developing knowledge. Now, if your focus is on equity of access, if that's one of the priorities, then we're going to have users across a whole range of capabilities. There's going to be advanced users and very beginning users, and then there's going to be users that have maybe special needs. So my view is that advanced users are really sort of ideal for coming up with the ideas for the use of the tools. They're the ones that can devote the time and have that creative space for thinking about how to apply new information in new ways. So they're great for helping to design your scope of the tool, what the functions will be of the tool, what the applications of the tool are. That is how you make use of the outputs from the tool to really affect decisions. The beginning users, the naive users, folks who don't have as much experience, those are really the folks to use to assess your design. That is the interface of the tool, to think about how you design a minimum entry level for the tool and help them move along a learning curve to more advanced uses of the tool. And then they're good for figuring out what kind of misconceptions you need to deal with in your tool. We talked about some of those misconceptions in the first webinar on communication effectiveness. Now, then there's a whole other group of users that take some special attention, and it's something that's often neglected until we end up having to transfer a tool, and it really can be difficult to change course at that point. And that has to do with users with special needs. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, software tools at the federal level do need to comply with a whole host of standards. They're called Section 508 compliance. I put a link here to Oregon State's policies on IT access. They've got training. Most universities, I think, at least I should say many universities, have training about that as well. It's not something to neglect. It's something that we probably should have a special speaker come in and talk about some of the details. But I want to highlight it is that if it's neglected early on in your project, it can really be difficult to change course going forward. So it's worth acquainting ourselves with some of those standards right from the start. And it's not necessarily hard to deal with, especially if you're dealing with, if you're implementing some of the communication effectiveness principles that we talked about last month. Now, the other piece that comes out of on this focus on equity of access, I've got it highlighted in the blue box outlined up here. It means that we're going to look at a wide range of users. We're going to have to think about scaling up that tool and then facilitating intermediaries. So what does that mean for design? It means that we can't have just a general product, but we need to think about general applications. That is a tool that can serve folks across sectors, across a range of capabilities, across a range of locations, the variables they're interested in, how accurate results have to be, in the different formats. We talked about some of that last month as well in terms of product formats. It also means that we need to design a tool so that people can come in at whatever level they're at right now, from novice to advanced, a simple product, a more complex product. And I'll show you an example of that coming up next. But it's not enough just to create the tool, but then to think about how to develop community around a tool and capacity. And the example I'll show is it really highlights that it's not enough to have a tool, but training is a key element in thinking about how to design your tool. And then because so many projects are dealing with the same issues over and over and over, we really have to look for synergies across projects. And it's what some of the cross-RESA projects for software extension and testing in new regions has been about. And that is adding functionality, extending data to new regions, thinking about handling things at different scales and so on. And then lastly, and I'll show an example of this as well, is that we need to think about how to connect the output of a tool with other information, other tools, and highlighting where it fits within a decision process. And that includes thinking about training. It includes thinking about interoperability of software systems, about feeding outputs from one into another, and so on. And the example I'm going to use here is the local 3-month temperature outlook. I think many of you are familiar with the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center's seasonal 3-month outlooks. This is the local version. I showed it last month as well. It's an example of how what seems to be a simple product really needs to be in multiple formats, all the way from useful for a very naive user, that is something just like these pie charts or a basic map, all the way up to an advanced user who might want probability of exceedance curves or probability of non-exceedance curves. And then you see that there's also things like a simple text discussion, so even a journalist can just come in, pull out a statement, drop it into an article without having to do any interpretation. The interpretation is built in to that text. You can see how there's also some text-based products, whether it's the text discussion or this probability of non-exceedance tables, probability of exceedance tables, and so on. Those get at some of the Section 508 compliance issues about having readable text as a product rather than graphical products. Now you can maybe think that all this investment in this much diversity of formats, they convey a lot of information, but that still is not enough. These outlooks have to be positioned within a whole flow of information in a decision process. So you can see highlighted in the green here, just in the diamond at the top, is the outlook itself. But to make maximum use of the outlook, we need other information before that. So, for example, you might need a vulnerability assessment, and then a situational assessment that leading into the use of the outlook. You can see over here on the left-hand side. And then there has to be some prior work in advance to know what kind of information are you trying to get from the outlook. Is that information of sufficient quality? If it's not, what other kind of studies needed to be done? And then whether there's enough skill in the outlook or not, your action plans are developed in advance. Just putting out an outlook isn't enough. A user has to think about all these other kinds of connections. And to make that outlook more available, these other elements need to be done in advance. Going back to this outlook, is that when the within the National Weather Service, the development of this tool didn't stop with just the creation of all these products. That is, the Climate Services Division implemented training to support the understanding and application of these tools so that every local weather forecast office in the country and the territories was trained on how to make use of this product, how to interpret it correctly, how to access it, and how to use it, and how to support others in using this tool. So I just want to use this as an example to kind of drive home that point, is that there's a lot of elements for the design of a tool that go beyond just a particular information product. What it means is that you've got software, but there has to be a commitment to that software and continuity for that software to exist, because you're asking a lot of the decision makers to get to know how to use it, and you're asking a lot of the intermediaries, whether it's extension agents or consulting firms or so on, you're asking a lot for them to learn this tool and figure out how it connects with the decision processes. When you're designing software, this is going to be the subject of the next month's webinar, when a software tool looks easy to use on the front end, that means that there's been a lot of work on the back end to make it easy to use. There's a lot of issues that are difficult to deal with about security, about data policies, about coding standards, about making sure you can have multiple users at the same time working without crossing the information. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I do want to stress for any of those listening now that are not developers of tools but maybe manage projects. This is something that really the software developers struggle with. It's a big investment, and the key is that the commitment and continuity to that software affects not just the developers, but the users and the intermediaries who invest their time in using the tool and figuring out how it connects with their decisions. And then this last one on the design strategies deals with the notion of copyright. It's something we don't talk about very often. I didn't put any examples here because I don't want to call out any specific institution, but I want you to look at the tools that you use or are responsible for developing. And if they're anywhere on there, there's a copyright symbol of your university or other organization, that means that many intermediaries can't use that product or tool outputs for their clients. Often in a university, we're used to fair use for education, but that doesn't apply for other intermediaries. And so I'm suggesting that we deal with that up front and make sure that all products have a Creative Commons non-exclusive license associated with them. Any that are produced by certainly the federal government are public domain, but for those tools that are developed as part of university research projects, this is a real challenge for use of those tools by intermediaries in ways that go beyond just education fair use. So now if we want to switch to design tactics, what we're going to focus on here is how to facilitate the use of the tool. This is more, these are kind of things that are more narrow in scope and easier to change. It fundamentally deals with just the interfaces, the graphical and text products, and frequent assessment of those. We talked about assessing the graphical and text products last month in the communication effectiveness webinar, and I'll ultimately be talking about how to test the interfaces of software in a future webinar. But the big notion for the design tactics is that the design is driven by user behavior, not by the preferences, not by the stated preferences of the users or by the preferences of the developers. I've seen projects come to almost a standstill when developers can't agree on a design. The way around that is to just go out and test some users and let that be the determinant. When we're online using a lot of tools from large companies, they're testing us all the time, even though we don't know it. They're testing different interfaces with different people, even different colors about whether we respond to that differently. We don't do that so often on smaller projects, but in the design, it's that user behavior that should drive our design, not our own preferences. Here's some examples on dealing with the interface. There are some sort of guidelines we could put out pretty easily about the interface, is that it helps to have a clear structure for that interface, the numbered steps or a checklist or a table. It really is helpful. We can see it be helpful across a range of tools. Here's two examples: the climate engine that was put out as part of CIRC earlier, I think CIRC 1.0, and then the CBI's Sagebrush Climate Console. You can see that they just have very clear steps, whether it's numbered, like the Climate Console here, or whether it's blocked off, like the climate engine. And you can see the pieces that you need to do to work through the tool, step by step by step by step. Another design kind of tactic is to make sure that your text is easily scannable just on one page without having to scroll and scroll and scroll. We do know that people just stop scrolling. They don't get so far. So anything we can do to put things in one page is important. And then this last one is something we really stressed in the last webinar, is that it's not enough just to present the information. We do need to have embedded in our design a way to interpret the information for people. Now, I want to focus a little bit more on that in the design tactics. We covered some of these concepts last month, but how do you actually integrate that in the design of a tool? It's important to think about the concepts that we're trying to convey with our tool, whether it's any of these that are here over on the right side, about whether we're focused on weather versus climate, or whether we want people to understand the difference between a threshold or an interval in talking about probability or likelihood, how we represent skill or accuracy or confidence of information, giving people guidance about what to look for going forward as information changes would be another one. In thinking about the design, we're trying to make sure that we explicitly reinforce concepts that we've selected in advance, and that we're correcting misconceptions that we encounter that people have. There's different ways to design that into a tool. One are the tool tips. You see a lot of tools having these now, but it also includes the interpretive text that goes along with the tool. So it's not just presenting the graph, but having a text version of that. What kind of ancillary material we provide with the tool, that is, whether it's a single we can convert a product or the output of a tool into a single page document with all of the links to the agencies that produce the data, the legends, the boilerplate interpretive text, and then the customized interpretive text, links to training and so on. That constitutes the full product. And then the ancillary material has to do with training or videos that show how to work through a tool and interpret the information that comes out. The other piece is thinking about the design is the not just the concepts, but how we actually communicate those concepts. I'm not going to say much more here. This was covered in a lot more detail in the first webinar. And Eva, as Eva is creating the style sheets and the best practices document, we'll come back to this, and there'll be I think some really nice guidance that goes beyond just even CIRC 2.0 out of that. And then the last here in terms of the design is in thinking about how we connect information. We know people have trouble connecting information. We know they have trouble connecting the past, present, and future. They often have to go to different products, and those products are in different units with different language. And so within our tool, how are we helping them connect that information from the past, present, and future? The same goes for predictions, whether it's seasonal climate outlooks or projections like the climate change projections, or observations which go back to the past. How do we help them connect what those are and how they relate to each other, short-term forecasts, long-term forecasts, and so on. And then how do we help them go from climate variables to the impact variables to the decision variables? Another is how do we go from local to regional scales? And then in maybe there's others, but this other one more is looking at forecasts and verifying the skill of those forecasts and doing attribution when those forecasts haven't worked well, explaining why they didn't work well or why they did work so well. We know that people have trouble in connecting information across all of these examples. And so there are some good cases. I would go back to some of the 3-month temperature outlooks as a good way to present some of that information. And there are others that I think will come up in the style sheets that Eva is helping put together. So here, the next steps then in thinking about where to go with looking at your design priorities, strategies, and tactics. My question for you then, in looking at your projects, what are your priorities? Is it equity? Is it efficiency of your investment? Or is it the regulatory and policy impact? There's two kinds of questions to ask in looking at your project about your design strategies. What strategies are you using? That is, how are you engaging? And then how are you developing your strategies? Not just which ones you have now, but then how are you developing? How are you developing them? And there's 3 kind of levels of support within CIRC 2.0 in particular that we've got. One, we've got the rich experience across prior RISA projects about what designs have worked in particular with map-based products or forecasts or projections, and what are we doing to build on those rather than just recreate them from scratch. And then what do we know already from our stakeholders? And I'd say that the core CIRC 2.0 staff, Megan and John Stevenson and Nathan, have a lot to help us with in kind of getting a sense of what our stakeholders in general or across the range of users might need. And then the social science team can help us engage in much more specific ways with specific sets of stakeholders as we're going through the interviews, the focus groups, the workshops, and the co-production to focus on not just our own project, but share that across CIRC 2.0. And then in thinking about design tactics, my question would be, is what tactics are you using? That is, the clear tactic is to test what your products are, your graphical and text products, and then the interfaces. What are you finding out, and can we share that across our different projects? One way is through these style sheets and standards documents that should be ready by the July retreat. And then the last is that going forward, I do want to stress for the CIRC 2.0 team is that I would really like to have some team consults to talk with you about your priorities and the strategies and tactics that you're currently using. Again, not as a way to judge your projects, but as a way to make sure that we're benefiting, each project is benefiting from a rich cross-RISA experience, the prior tools that have been developed under CIRC 2.0, and what the teams are doing now with their different stakeholder groups. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Megan and see if we've got any questions from the larger group and then from within the CIRC 2.0 team.
So if anybody has a question, please feel free to just click on that hand raising function and we can unmute you. I will note that there was a link shared by Eric Steeman about the link in the chat, if you check it out, for the Creative Commons attribution that they've used for their Reach Ag project.
Great. It's good to see that. It's good to see that there has been a tool. We don't see it very often, and I see very many more copyright statements more than a Creative Commons licensing statement. Yeah. So thanks, Eric.
So anyone that has a question, like I said, if you tap on that little hand raising function, that'll indicate to me you have a question. I can unmute you.
So could they type it into the chat bar as well?
Or you can also, yeah, you can type it into the chat bar if you prefer. I can also unmute everyone on the webinar, and the CIRC team could begin to discuss if we want to move on to that stage. Oh, there's a question. Oh, okay. There are people typing into the chat.
And I'm happy to go back to prior slides too if anybody needs one.
Sure. Okay. I'm actually going to go ahead and unmute Eric and let him go ahead and ask his question. There you go, Eric.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, great. Hey, Holly, this is Eric. So I was, as I was listening, I was just thinking as somebody developing tools, what your thoughts might be on mobile development and how much we should be thinking about mobile responsiveness, just given the fact of how many people are using mobile devices. So I just thought I would get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think my view is that it goes back to what your project objectives are, and then asking what it is that people are trying to do. Is it something that makes sense to do in a mobile setting? Is it something that for equity of access, when many people don't have a desktop or a laptop, but their mobile phone is their computer, it is their access, that would suggest that a mobile application makes sense. But if you're dealing with a return on investment kind of objective, and you're working with, say, a high-end client, then unless they really need a mobile application, that wouldn't suggest it. So it really depends on what people are trying to do and your overall project objectives. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, and so my next question is actually from Amanda Cravens, and I'm going to go ahead and let me find you, unmute you really quick. And There you go. Amanda, we can hear you.
All I was wanting to ask was, with the report you mentioned, whether it's possible to get a copy of that, or what the stage of that is.
What? I didn't catch the first part. The copy
You
of what?
You mentioned that CIRC report and was interested if that's something that's available or you're still working on.
Oh, the white paper or the standards? There's the white paper that includes all of the frameworks that we'll be talking about in the webinar, and that's now that is available. And then
Okay,
the style sheet and the style sheet and the standards documents, that's going to be brought to the CIRC group in their July retreat. And so that'll be a product that comes out of this year of CIRC.
I think I'm talking about the white paper.
Okay, Megan can distribute that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Great, and the next question is actually from Denise Latch. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You can go ahead and ask your question. You might still be on mute, Denise.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear.
There you go.
Okay. So Holly, this is kind of overwhelming to me, and because there's all of these ideas, and I'm not a designer, but it seems like we probably should have had these conversations a lot earlier before we started designing our tools.
Yeah,
so,
you know, that's always the way it is.
Okay, well that makes me feel better, because the question I was going to ask is, so what do we do since we didn't do it at the beginning? How do we go back and think about this stuff?
Yeah, and that's where being able to document, I think just at this stage, it's documenting what are the project objectives, what are the design priorities, what strategies are people using, and then what tactics the tactics, that is, whether you're using tooltips and the ancillary information and making sure that our language is consistent across tools, that's all manageable going forward. Even some of the design strategy stuff can be addressed now, and certainly if you're thinking about having a long-lived tool that's transitioned to an agency, then we have to deal with some of the Section 508 issues and some of the technical sustainability issues that will happen in the next webinar that we'll cover there. But I think just even acknowledging what your objectives are and how your design relates to that is an improvement over what we see in many projects.
Okay.
That's because the reality is that just with so many projects, people just go forward, and the objectives are embedded in the original proposals, but maybe not in a way that is just really, really clear about how it connects with the ultimate tool that's developed.
So is this a conversation that should be happening with the larger CIRC group, or is it something that the designers figure out?
If you go back to, there's different elements of that. The CIRC team, I think, maybe has some say in what are your overall priorities. That is it equity of access? Is it return on investment? Is it about policy and regulatory impact? Is it, and for the folks designing a particular tool, it's helpful just to even be able to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes we're developing software and we get asked, this happens in I should say more projects than it ought to. Is that halfway through somebody wants to know what's your business model for sustainability? How are you going to make it pay for itself later? How do you spin it off into a private sector product? I know I've been pressured that way, is to spin software tools off to be licensed for the private sector. That's a whole different, the design of that is very different than if you're talking about equity of access.
But we might also be spinning it off to the national toolbox or something. So we have to understand what those criteria are and what those standards are.
Mm-hmm. And so just having a conversation, this is where I think the team consults come in, is not looking at, say, a web interface testing kind of consult, but just a basic discussion about what were the priorities for your tools, what strategies are you using, what are you doing now, where do you see your tool going? Not in a way to judge that project, but just to get it out on paper and allow us to compare projects over time and what kind of ultimately to look at the effectiveness and reach of some of those tools.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Is there any other questions that folks have? Give a minute to see if people have. Either you can use the hand raising function or start to chat, type something into the question text box, and that'll indicate to me that you have a question. So Holly, do you want to open it up to the CIRC team at this point?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So just to let everybody know, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody on the call. So if you can put yourself on mute, that'll just help with any kind of audio issues that we can have when multiple people are unmuted. So just go ahead and unmute yourself when you would like to talk. Otherwise, keep yourself on mute. It'd be great. Okay. You should be able to feel free to click on your unmute button and ask a question if you have it, or if you're on the CIRC team. Maybe somebody on the CIRC team, try to unmute yourself and see if we have that function working properly.
Yeah. And I hope this presentation wasn't too overwhelming. It's more of a bigger picture kind of presentation because it is something that happens at the start of a project, right? It's not looking at a particular product or a particular screen. It's more thinking about how you connect a tool to what users are trying to accomplish. And
Okay.
Let's see if I can get this to work properly here.
It seems to work fine. Unmuting.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I don't have to get. Just me?
Okay.
I don't know. You guys obviously can hear me, but and actually I did have a comment just to reiterate and support what Denise had said about working together and kind of having a strategy around these tools and the kind of the timing of that and the importance of that. That I would second that, and also, you know. We haven't really, I don't know how much we really got into this issue of like how integrative all of our tools should be for part of the team, that we're all doing these, we have these different streams, we're all working kind of separately, how integrative they actually should be, because if we need to have them be very modular and integrated, then there has to be a lot more collaboration up front, and the later we do that, the more difficult it becomes. So that might be one thing for us to talk about is, you know, how integrative some of this work should be, and, you know, maybe we should have some more developer on developer.
Ridge Wilderness, does that sound right?
That's it.
I don't know. I don't know. Well, Magic Mountain's one. So you do need.
Okay. So as we're unmuting people, if you can make sure you just self-mute if you are on the call. We're getting a little bit of interference here.
So this is Denise again. I wonder if this is something that we should be adding to our monthly meetings, that we should have, you know how we have all the discussions of what people are doing. I wonder if we should have a thing on our agenda, Megan, where we should start talking about some of these issues on a regular basis. And thinking about what Eric had just said about how integrated our tools should be, I think we need to discuss that. And we also need to start discussing style sheets and standards and all of those things. So I wonder if it's something that we just start adding to our monthly meeting.
So that's just, so all you need is Magic Mountain? Okay. Okay.
So we have somebody here. I'm going to try to
Okay.
There we go.
Denise, a question for you. You say we should put it on the agenda every month, but how would you go about discussing whether the tools are integrated between each other? I mean, you've got people working on the coast, people working on delivering climate data. How do you envision this cohesion?
I'm not envisioning it yet, but it feels like we should be thinking about some of the things, especially that Holly, and this is off the top of my head, talked about last time, where we should be using common terminology, common units, that we might even have an interface that looks similar as people start to use the different tools. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know, but it's just all these things that we should be thinking about or talking about together.
One of the things we discovered, and Holly I'm sure has come across that too, is in climate, and all of us scientists use SI units, but the managers and policymakers don't want SI units, so we keep putting choice between the two. So even though we would love it if everybody used the same units, it's not the reality of it. So lots of issues like that.
So maybe, and this is maybe too far in the weeds, but maybe what we have is two versions of things, where we have, here's units that are commonly used by the managers in the sector, and here are scientific units. I don't know. I think there are ways to get around these things as long as we get them on the table.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Just an example, just a way to toggle units.
Right.
Oh, and I've seen plenty of decision support tools where you can toggle units.
That's what we've done. But it's just an example of, when you say we need to unify, it's just like, it's difficult.
No, I don't think we're saying unify. I think we're saying integrate.
Integrate, yeah. But I mean, it's like John Abetoglu's site to get climate data. Why would he use non-SI units, for example?
Because his program can't use them.
Yeah, and I think another place where the team can try to at least have some consistency, or what are some of the concepts, the key concepts that they're trying to deal with.
Yeah. Pleasant View Ridge Wilderness. Okay.
And I think the other thing, and I was looking at that tool that, Dominique, that you guys had done at CBI, where you had the instructions laid out really easily in that right panel. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we could think about integrating, is that all of our tools have a panel that looks like something like that.
Yeah. It's been fascinating too, because we've tested that, and believe it or not, people do not do 1, 2, 3.
Oh, we believe it.
Yeah, you can see on some websites that people will be guided along a bar. You see it when you're paying a bill for online, for example, where you have to get through step 1 through step 3. They kind of force you to follow the steps because people don't do 1, 2, 3 so easily. So presenting them option 1 first, and that's the only thing they can focus on.
Right.
And then step 2 and then step 3 as they move through the tool.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have another meeting to go to, so I'm going to log out. But thank you, Ollie. This was really a good presentation again. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. It's a big topic. It's like you said, Denise, maybe a little overwhelming, but it's one that if we can at least get the CIRC 2.0 team stuff out on paper, I think it would help a lot of other folks as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I agree, Holly. Thank you. It was a great presentation. It made me think about a lot of things. Like I said, I'm a little bit overwhelmed, but that's never stopped us before. Just put us back to work.
We're the team consults. If folks would schedule just a conversation that we can have to kind of work through some of these for their individual projects, I think that would really help move this along much more quickly on the design site. And so that's kind of my request to each of the teams, is not to cover all the things about your tool, but specifically about this topic, is that we could get started on that even now.
Okay, so Megan and I will work on making that mandatory rather than, okay, maybe we'll do it if we find time, but Megan and I will make sure that those get scheduled. Okay, Megan?
Yes, sure, Denise.
Amanda Cravens, I see that your hand is raised. You're actually unmuted, so if you can go ahead and ask your question if you have one, or not sure if you just bumped the hand raising.
No, I actually, you know, I know that this has come out from within the RISA network. It's something that both within the climate science centers that I'm affiliated with, and then some folks from the climate hubs that I've been working with, we've also been thinking about. And just wanted to mention that because, especially as we're, you know, as everybody is aware, in a world where duplicating things is really not something we want to be doing, might want to flag to, at some point, follow up on that conversation across the different climate service organizations.
So are you guys having meetings about the design regularly, or meetings about your tools regularly?
So a group of folks from the climate hubs across the country and myself have been working sort of on similar questions around the design of tools, and then my own research. I'm based at USGS, and my own research really focuses on one aspect of it on evaluating tools from a cognitive and social basis. So, you know, I mean, I think there's definitely differences in the emphasis, which I think is really exciting, but I just would love to see it be building on things rather than duplicating things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so anything we could do to kind of be coordinated with that would be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't, you know, I literally, this was just seeing the webinar on an announcement, and so I don't know enough about the structure, and I'm really looking forward to reading that white paper, but I'd love to, you know, maybe schedule a conversation with you offline and figure out what the best way to do that would be.
Okay, let's do that, yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Holly. This is Megan. Thanks, Holly, for another great webinar. I think these always get everyone thinking about new things.
Yeah, and so yeah, we'll end up with the answers, but the first step is to get folks thinking. And then the next webinar is a month from now. I think it's, what is it, April 24th or 25th?
Let's see, it's April
Monday.
24th at 1:30.
Okay.
And on technical sustainability. So thanks everyone for joining. The recording of the webinar will be made available on the CBI website. And Kaya, are there any last things you need to say?
Not for me. Thank you for everybody for attending, and thanks Holly and Megan for a great presentation. And yeah, just keep an eye out for an email with a link with the recording.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye.